So, I think worst case scenario, you could see Russia making land grabs in sparsely populated areas of the high north that they view to be strategic. You could see the Russians begin to operate, especially as the ice melts further and further. You could see the Russians operating with near impunity surface action groups, submarines, aircraft in the high north in ways that, similar to what China's done in the South China Sea, create a almost de facto sovereignty in that area.
So, Alex, you've been looking at, the Arctic Circle and what NATO needs to be doing in order to kind of fortify it. Before we get into the nitty gritty of everything, would you be able to explain for us why the Arctic Circle is so important?
Sure. Well, as we look at the decrease of sea ice in the northern hemisphere and in the Arctic and near Arctic, it's going to become an increasingly important part of great power competition. You're going to have the long fabled Northwest Passage that explorers were looking for centuries may actually become a reality. And the shipping times between Europe, North America, and Asia in a world where there's no Arctic or for a significant portion of the year, there's a decreasing amount of Arctic sea ice, you're going to have shipping times cut in half or more. So it's going to revolutionize commercial shipping between the hemispheres and between the continents. And then you have in the northern part of the high north, the northern latitudes, you do have the potential for significant natural resources. You do have the potential for rare earth minerals, oil and gas, all sorts of valuable commodities. So we're in a position now where, as Russia has increasingly shown its aggression in Ukraine and in other places, but also has invested significantly in military capabilities and bases in the Arctic, we have seen this part of the world become an increasing area of great power competition. And it's going to, my prediction is that's only going to continue in the years and decades ahead.
What's so strategically significant about the Arctic? Is it just that no one else is kind of there yet? Besides the raw materials, what's the point of putting military bases there?
Well, part of the strategic value is if you look at who borders the Arctic, you've got the United States and Alaska, you've got significant swaths of Canada, you've got these, I talk about in my article, you have Greenland, which is technically Danish, but has a complicated internal governance structure. You're very close to Iceland. You've got other Danish territories. You have Norwegian territories. You have parts of Scandinavia, Sweden, and Finland. So it's really this part of the world where NATO boundaries, particularly now that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, you have a part of the world where Russia and the US, Canada, and now significant other NATO partners are all meeting geographically. And as we think about shipping routes, as we think about distances, especially from an air and sea perspective, distances between each other's territories, this is an area where you can imagine significant potential military conflict due to proximity and due to the things that I was just talking about, the strategic and resource opportunities in the Arctic.
And you said that NATO has some strategic deficiencies in the Arctic. I mean, how would Finland's accession into NATO and Sweden's likely accession change this?
Well, the hope is that, and this is one of the arguments those of us who supported their accession made, was that Sweden particularly has an extraordinarily capable Navy. They have a Navy that for 400 plus years has been at the leading edge in the Baltic, but also across Northern Europe. In the undersea domain, there's a very capable submarine force resident at the Swedish Navy. And so the hope is that in addition to land-based aircraft, the Finns have a great intelligence gathering capability. So the hope would be that by adding Sweden and Finland to the alliance, there's going to be a very profound increase in undersea, air, intel gathering, and other military and strategic capabilities that can support the alliance in both tracking what Russia's doing in that part of the world, but also being able to deter Russian aggression because of the capabilities that they bring to bear.
How do you even prevent Russia from, putting a military base there or from kind of starting to stake their territory there? I mean, it's largely uninhabited, and no country really has claim over it. How do you stop them from doing that?
Well, there are a couple things. So we can't stop them from doing what they've been doing on their territory. And that's they've been radically expanding the number to Cold War levels or more. What sorts of capabilities are on Russian territory? Nothing we can do about that. What we can do is deny them the potential to make use of places like Svalbard, which is this oddly structured. Technically it has Norwegian sovereignty, but there's a 1920 treaty that creates a very complex governance structure that allows some Russian influence, despite it technically having Norwegian sovereignty. There are other anomalous places like the Faroe Islands that have Danish sovereignty, but also have a level of self governance that potentially can allow Russian influence and even some minor military access and intel gathering access in ways that are very damaging to NATO security. Greenland's another example. So what we can do is work with NATO partners like Denmark and Norway to deny access to places like these kind of anomalous quasi-sovereign parts of the northern latitudes. The other thing we can do, you look at Canada. Canada's spending about 1% of its GDP on defense. Canada 10, 15 years ago was working very aggressively to build an icebreaker fleet that could significantly contribute to the NATO capacity in the Arctic. They've stopped that program. The Canadians have fallen dramatically behind in what they should be contributing in capability for NATO's northern flank. So, what we can be doing is having the entire alliance contributing to deterring Russian aggression beyond Russian sovereign territory. So that's the things I just mentioned in terms of these kind of anomalous islands, but also building up Canadian capacity, U.S. capacity. The U.S. is a lot we could be doing to grow our Arctic warfighting, and when I say warfighting, I mean deterrence of potential conflict. That capacity, we have a lot we could be doing as well.
Mm. And Svalbard's quite interesting because, Russia actually, they had an outpost there. They had some coal mines there, I think. And there was kind of like a mini little Russian village or something there where they spoke Russian and they were Russian, even though this island's part of Norway. And it's all very complicated. But is this kind of part of Putin wanting to regain some of this old Soviet territory? Because eventually Russia ended up leaving that part of Svalbard. It's, that that area is pretty much abandoned by the coal mines and everything.
Yeah, so it's a mix of your points. I think apt that there's obviously there's a mix of economic incentives, but also with Putin, it's a lot of national prestige. It's a lot about how can he project power. Oftentimes, as with the coal mines in Svalbard, yes, there's a superficial economic explanation, but the reality is he's trying to reclaim what he views as Russia's past glory. And we can look back 15 years when they took a submersible to the bottom of near the Arctic Circle, and they put a Russian flag on the floor of the ocean. This is about, in a lot of ways, Russia being a great power. And so we have to look at it from that perspective as well, that what we're dealing with is not simply a resource contest. This is another domain of the same sort of conflict that we're having with Russia in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in Eastern Europe more broadly, in Central Asia. This is another field where Vladimir Putin's attempting to reclaim greater Russia. And we have to be cognizant of that.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine, their full scale invasion of Ukraine, it hasn't been very successful. And their military is already stretched. It's all in Ukraine right now. I mean, even as Prigozhin's mutiny was kind of happening, there were people warning that actually Moscow doesn't have a lot of defenses because so much of their military is in Ukraine at the moment. Can they even afford to be using any more forces or any part of their military in engaging in something like this?
Well, they have taken some of their Arctic specialist troops and actually deployed them to Ukraine because the main manpower situation is so dire for them. On the other hand, a lot of the capabilities that they need to be menacing in the high north are things like submarines, things like very specific Arctic capable aircraft. So they can still be a very potent threat in the Arctic even without large numbers of troops. The chances of a significant infantry battle in the high north is not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is Russian submarines using permissive environments in places like the Svalbard and Iceland and Greenland to come through called the GI-UK gap, the passage where traditionally the U.S. would this is the kind of waterway between the U.K., Greenland, and Iceland, where the U.S. would during the Cold War would have sent our Navy and our reinforcements to Europe in the event of a Soviet invasion. And this has been an area of submarine competition between the U.S. and Russians for 50, 60 years. My concern is that they're going to use permissive environments in the north to grow their capacity to negatively impact NATO freedom of movement along the GI-UK gap and in similar areas. So they can be tied down in Ukraine for as long as they want to be and still pose a pretty significant threat to operating in the Arctic.
Russia is a ginormous country and they are used to these Arctic temperatures. I mean, just look at Siberia. And is there cause for concern that Russia, I mean, there's Canada and there's Greenland, but there's not quite another country in this fight that is to the same level, I guess, of Russia that really understands the Arctic as much as they do. Is that kind of cause for concern as well?
Well, it's certainly cause for concern that by traditional metrics, Russia has, and this is, I think, borne out by the number of bases, by the amount of the defense budget that they spend on Arctic warfare capabilities. That's certainly the home terrain for them, which is why it's so important that our Canadian friends, for instance, start making the investments now in those capabilities. From a geographic standpoint, there's no NATO country who has a greater territorial stake in the freedom of movement in the high north than Canada. And 1.3 or so percent of GDP is just not going to cut it. The United States, as well, during the Cold War, we had pretty substantial Arctic capabilities. We allowed them to atrophy. We should be making very significant investments in that area as well. And look, I think Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, the UK to some extent, all can play a very significant role. And that's the beauty of NATO. It's that as a whole, we can match anything the Russians can throw at us because we're taking the combined competencies and skills and capabilities of a large block of countries. And I think that's the beauty of the Stockholm and Helsinki succession. And that's really what makes NATO such an effective alliance.
If we include this in the other conflicts that are happening, there's obviously the war in Ukraine. There's loads, huge amounts of weapons that are being poured in there. We're seeing a really vast militarization of the South China Sea, and then we're seeing this conflict. I mean, does NATO have any more resources that they can expel, any more resources at their disposal that they can use for this? Or is it kind of like you said about Russia, that it's just kind of, it's different departments, so it might not impact it?
I think it's a similar situation where, the United States, what we really should be putting to use in the Arctic are our Coast Guard icebreakers. We only have two. We need to have more. There's been a long effort for us to build that capacity. That's not going to have an applicable use anywhere except Antarctica and the Arctic. So that should be kind of standalone. Look at the capabilities of the Swedes. The Swedes should have the capacity to do undersea warfare in the Baltic, but also to provide some capability farther north. And they already, of course, for their own sovereign purposes, have a pretty sophisticated early warning system in their far north, and they can extend that and grow upon that to help the alliance as a whole. You look at Canada. Canada has, they've been recently rolling out an Indo-Pacific strategy, talking about what Canada is going to do more significantly in Asia. Well, I would like to see Canada focus first and foremost on its NATO contributions to defending the high north, and then that would be, I think, a more useful uh, application of resources than Canada trying to deploy its relatively small forces in the South China Sea or somewhere else in the Indo-Pacific. So I think we have the capacity. I think collectively we do. We just have to make sure we're using our resources efficiently.
What's the danger if we don't use our resources efficiently, if the West kind of doesn't wake up to what's happening here?
Well, the danger is a couple things. I mean, one is you have Russian bases that basically do not have a sufficient deterrent on the NATO side, and as Russia is grasping for ways to show its power, ways to assert itself, they could see the Arctic as a sphere that's open to. We certainly have seen now that Russia doesn't view territorial aggression as something that as a no go. That's not something that they're afraid of doing. So I think worst case scenario, you could see Russia making land grabs in sparsely populated areas of the high north that they view to be strategic. You could see the Russians begin to operate, especially as the ice melts further and further. You could see the Russians operating with near impunity surface action groups, submarines, aircraft in the high north in ways that, similar to what China's done in the South China Sea, create a almost de facto sovereignty in that area. And that has a huge economic impact if we're talking about potential new shipping routes. And it has a huge strategic impact if the high north has essentially become a Russian lake. So that's, to me, without deterrence, without a serious NATO deterrent capability, those are some of the worst case scenarios that we could see in years and decades ahead.
I wanted to finish up by asking you what role China has to play in all of this. I mean, I think we saw a while ago China kind of attempted to invest in Greenland with some transport links, and then I think it all kind of got blocked in one way or another. But what stake does China want to play here?
Yeah, it's a really important question. They call themselves a near Arctic power, which is absurd, but that is what they have proclaimed themselves. They have created what's called the Polar Silk Road, which is the kind of the polar equivalent of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the goal is to expand Chinese influence uh, towards the high north with the same sorts of uh, overall long-term objectives as I just outlined for Russia, which is potentially to have some level of influence over the possibility of a new shipping route between Asia and the Western Hemisphere. And in the event that that comes to pass, the Chinese want to make sure that they have significant influence economically, strategically, and I think potentially, particularly if you look at the number of nuclear powered icebreakers that the Chinese are constructing, it's not hard to make a case that over time they may want to begin deploying naval assets in the Arctic. And you look at the South Pole, at the Antarctic, just to get a sense of how the Chinese are thinking about polar matters. The Chinese have become exceptionally active in Antarctica. They've built multiple bases. They've actually violated the Antarctic Treaty by having military capacity in the Antarctic. So I think if you extrapolate a little bit and you look at how they've operated elsewhere, there's a real case to be made that China is probably certainly behind Russia because of proximity issues, but China certainly has an interest and views it as in their national interests to have a robust capacity to operate in the Arctic in the medium to long term.
Well, Alex, that's all very fascinating and also a bit terrifying. Um, Thank you so much for chatting with me about all of that and explaining that to our viewers. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention on the record before I stop the recording?
I would just say that, as we deal with this horrific situation in Ukraine, we have to not lose sight of the fact that Russia is not a one trick pony. They don't view Ukraine as their only interest, and they have the capacity, despite what we've seen with the ruble in the last couple of days, despite everything that's gone on. They still have an enormous amount of latent power that can be used all over Eurasia, to include the high north. And so I think it's important that policymakers in London and Washington and Ottawa, throughout NATO, in Brussels, don't lose sight of the fact that they may be bogged down in Ukraine. It may be a loss, but that doesn't mean that Russia as a great power is anywhere close to extinguished at this point.